I just want to tell that private investments are so important. We've just heard an example about this, in order to put money in projects. But these projects, of course, have to be trusted. It has to be a trusted market, so science-based. It's not so simple in a world as we are living in, with the socials, with the fact that information sometimes are not clear, not transparent, they are not based on science data. So I think this is a really important session, and it's going to be with us, our moderator, Ralph Chami, CEO, co-founder, Blue Green Future, and Rebalancing Earth. Ralph? Hi. Please, stage is yours.
Thank you.
Pleased to meet you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I wanted to thank One Ocean Foundation and the University of Bocconi for this wonderful event. And so I've been tasked with moderating a very interesting panel on how to build a blue natural capital market. Before I introduce my colleagues and ask them to join me on stage, I thought, before we talk about the how, maybe it's good to just step back a little and say, why? Why are we even bothering to build a market? We are not trying just to build a market for the sake of a market. So if somebody were to ask you, why are you even bothering to build markets around nature? Well, a good place to start is where we are right now. The problem we are facing right now, as we all are finding out one way or another, is that the current system, the current economic paradigm that we practice is not sustainable. We are facing already the twin crises of climate change and the loss of nature and its biodiversity. So the current system, the way I would usually describe it, has a very, very bad relationship with the living nature, has a very good relationship with the dead nature. We know how to value dead things. If I tell you what is the value of a tree outside, not a fruit tree, just a tree, I would say a lot of people would think I'm talking about the value of this tree once you cut it down and you sell it as timber. But what if I were to tell you that that living tree outside has value just by it living for itself, has economic, financial value that goes along with its intrinsic value. But somehow our economic paradigm, our current paradigm, does not see that. The living nature to our current economic paradigm is invisible. So if you ask the question, well, how come we don't see nature for itself? That's because about maybe 300 or 400 years ago, we made a fatal assumption, in my opinion, that nature is inert, that nature is infinitely supplied. And if we had time, I would pinpoint you to very famous texts by very famous philosophers that somehow decided for all of us that nature was infinitely supplied. And since I'm an economist and I taught economics and finance for many years, when something is infinitely supplied, the price of it would be zero. Voila. So if nature is indeed infinitely supplied, be it the ocean or be it land, then why bother? You just basically think about growth. Why should I bother about my impact on nature, since nature is infinitely supplied? And as a result, what happened is our practice from 300 or 400 years ago and forward has been to cut, destroy, extract, pollute with impunity, because after all, nature is infinitely supplied. And then we end up here. And here is where we realize, the hard realization is that nature is actually finite. Nature is a living system, is not a mechanical clock, as Mr. Descartes would have us think. It's a living system, and it looks after us, and we need to look after her so we can live all sustainably and for a very long time. So what happened to us when the climate crisis arrived? we need to fight climate change. And the first thing, realization was, well, we need nature to fight climate change. How else are you going to grab all that carbon that's sitting up in the atmosphere? So the case was made for nature indirectly through the climate window. We need to fight climate change, so we need nature. But nature on its own deserves attention, as we're now realizing, because we are not only facing risk of the loss of climate change risk, but also the loss of nature and its biodiversity. So that's the why. The why we need a market, because we know now through the science, and we're going to have a premier scientist among us shortly, they made the case many, many times over that we need nature for itself, for its biodiversity, for its ecosystem services, but also to fight climate change. So the case was made in the science. The question is, from the science, how do you go to the markets? That's the how. And to sort of talk about the how, we've assembled quite an impressive panel. I will not do justice to their CVs in light of the short time we have together, but I'd like first to invite Professor Carlos Duarte to the stage. Quickly about Carlos, because his CV is quite extensive. He is the Distinguished Professor of Marine Science at the King Abdullah University in the United Kingdom, but more importantly, Carlos, at least in my view and view of many others, he is the father of blue carbon. He's the expert to go to when you want to ask any questions about the oceans. We always end up seeking his wisdom on anything related to the blue natural capital. And from the market side, I'd like to invite my colleague Torsten Thiele to join Carlos. Torsten has extensive experience in the markets, 20 years. He's the Executive Director of Global Ocean Trust. He focuses on innovative finance for marine conservation, but Torsten is much more than that. His advice is sought by governments and by organizations all over the world, and literally I cannot do justice to these CVs. And next I would like to invite Sylvie Goulard to stage, please. She is currently the co-chair of the International Panel on Biodiversity Credits, and she's professor of the practice at Bocconi. She's also been the former member of the European Parliament, former Minister of Defense, former Deputy Governor of the Banque de France, so you can see extensive experience there, on the policy side also. And last, certainly but not least, is Dr. Jean Leon, who is currently a national development advocate for small island economies. Jean? And Jean, until recently, was the governor of the Caribbean Development Bank. Among his many hats, he was also my colleague at the IMF for 25 years. Jean is an expert. He's led missions all over the world, so he's really an expert in development economics, so I think 30 years of experience. So with this, I'm going to join them shortly. So what we're going to talk about is not the why. Of course, the why is always there, but really how. If somebody says to you, so how do we build a market? Okay, so to start, I'm going to start with Carlos, because we need to anchor ourselves in reality. We need to anchor ourselves in the science. So, Carlos, first of all, for some of us that may not know really what blue natural capital is. So what is blue natural capital, and why is it, from a science perspective, why is it important to us?
So Blue Natural Capital, thank you, Ralph, for the introduction, and also One Ocean for the invitation to the event. And Blue Natural Capital refers to the abundance of components of the ocean that can be ecosystems, habitats, species, communities that support the essential processes upon which our well-being depend. And that includes, for instance, climate regulation. It includes nutrient cycling, sanitation of coastal waters. It includes the defense of shorelines, and that is performed by marine life. Not every component of marine life has a role as natural capital, but that is basically the real estate of the ocean. and it's the infrastructure upon which we derive value from the ocean. But that infrastructure, as Ralph mentioned, was invisible to us, not only because it was believed to be in infinite supply, because the oceans are so huge that we cannot possibly deplete them. We have depleted also, as Sylvie Earle said earlier, about half of the natural capital that we had a century ago is lost. In many instances, we have even lost a lot more. So 90% of the abundance of great whales or sharks, or even 2/3 of the extent of coral reefs are gone. So we are eroding down the natural capital, but then we are found with another predicament, which is deeply rooted in the thinking, illegal thinking and economic thinking of the Western world, not necessarily other cultures, which is the fact that the ocean was declared in the Justinian Code that was composed by Justinian I. There was a Roman Empire from the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople. He decided to reformulate the legal code, and then that legal code declared the ocean terra nullius, which becomes no one's land, so no one can buy nature in the ocean. So you can buy nature elsewhere, but not in the ocean, because there's no private property. And then they also declared marine life res nullis, which means that belongs to no one. That means that everybody that grabs it first owns it. And that has led to a predicament called the tragedy of the commons, where there was really no incentive for people to leave, for instance, fish stocks alone, because if you don't catch them, somebody else will catch them. So then that has really been the driver of the depletion of natural capital. And then really what we are doing today and discussing in this session is how can we reverse that damage, and now look at natural capital as real estate, as infrastructure that we can invest on. We might not be able to own it or buy it, as it was said earlier, but we can invest in the benefits that we receive from this natural capital. And that conversation really started with carbon, because carbon is the first of those services that has a market value. And that market value has created a market of blue natural capital, that the projects that are already delivering credits, they have committed to restore 1.5 million hectares of mangrove forests, which means to increase the global mangrove extent by 15%. So it's already a significant commitment. And the projects that are already functioning in the ocean are committed to remove 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide through those projects. And this is only 2% of the potential. But carbon is just an intermediate step towards natural capital. And what we are working on is to develop an investable product that has a recognized value, that is natural capital, where carbon and climate is just one component, but it has many other benefits that make it investable. And we want to make that value proposition for all of the private sector, because without the engagement of the private sector, there's no hope that we can rebuild our oceans or even rebuild our climate system.
Thank you, Carlos. So a lot of people, when you say natural capital, they think it's, first of all, they think it's trees. That's at least when I came into this space, and I learned from your work that it's not only about trees, it's about the ocean. But then people think it's about only flora. But is it only flora, or is it does fauna play a role? Do they?
Yeah, so something that everybody can relate to, that is not a tree, not flora, is bees, right? Bees is the epitome of natural capital, because bees, small as they are essential for 70% of the crops, and pollination of crops by bees support about 1/3 of global food production. We have lost about 25% of the species of bees. They are declining everywhere. Last year, I was involved in reintroducing and restocking bees in Sardinia, in an area that was devastated by wild forest fires in 2022. And unfortunately, all of the bees that we reintroduced, which were about, I think, 20 million, died 2 weeks later because we had an unprecedented heat wave in Sardinia. So bees are essential for us. They are not flora, they are not trees, they are insects. But our lives, our food supply depends on bees. So that's a clear example of a non-photosynthetic organism that is clearly natural capital.
Wonderful, thank you. So Torsten, the science says nature is important to us. intrinsically and for our economics, for our society. So where do we start? If you want to build a market around this knowledge, where does one start?
I'm delighted to discuss this here because it was here in the north of Italy where over 500 years ago, clever people invented double-entry bookkeeping. And we are at a very similar revolution. We're at the revolution of entering nature properly into our balance sheets. And that revolution allows us then to provide the massive scale of transition. Because this is a transition in mindset, in understanding that these externalities, our impacts on nature, matter, and that whether I'm a government, whether I'm a corporate, I need to understand what I do to nature and what I take from nature. And that ability to account for it allows us then to invest in it. And we need investment at all the scales. We need it at the millions, the billions, and the trillions. And that means we need appropriate markets that can channel that type of funding. We need to move to a position where every financial institution, where every asset owner says to themselves, what is the allocation in my portfolio that goes to nature, that goes to ocean? And only when I'm aware of that allocation and I can identify and think of those consequences, will I be able to actually transition in that just transition way that we are all aiming towards. So this is what we're facing. So why is this such a critical moment? So last week in the UK Parliament, we introduced the High Integrity Marine Natural Capital Markets Roadmap. This week in the US government announced a national ocean biodiversity strategy. So the awareness for the relevance of this is there, but the connection that we make between the underlying nature asset, which in many cases is public and common, and the investable product that allows us to be traded on markets requires these basic characteristics that we have in markets, which really boil down to three key areas. So it is around what are the rights and asset definitions, and here we already have mentioned environmental outcomes around carbon, around biodiversity, around nutrient cycling. We need to clarify regulatory environments for these different markets, and it is in compliance around biodiversity where the biggest gain will be here, because it is in delivering compliance that a very significant part of nature restoration becomes an investable opportunity. And it's the investment by the financial stakeholders in the companies that deliver superior nature outcomes where the upside lies. And then markets are all about efficiency and liquidity. And so, of course, we already have entry points and examples. We have blue bonds that can be traded on the bond markets. We have blue carbon resilience credits. We have a European trading mechanism for carbon certificates. But all of these things need to be advanced, built out, and the bright young minds of Bocconi are asked to be part of this process of creating these markets. This is about contractual arrangements, this is about structuring. All the skills are there to do this as soon as we make that switch.
Thank you. Sylvie, you're the co-chair of a very important initiative that I believe it's France and the UK. It's the National Advisory Panel on Biodiversity. So what is that all about, and how does it tie with what you've heard before?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for inviting us. It's a fascinating event. I'm glad to be part of it and to learn so much. Well, we were created last year in June when France held a summit with Mia Motley from your area, the Caribbean, on how can we finance development and protection of nature and climate, because we should never put countries in the south in front of the dilemma, either I invest in the future of my people or I protect nature. So we were born at this occasion. It is a global panel with people from all around the world, 25 people more or less, indigenous people and local communities, people from finance, big financial companies, but also NGOs, etc. So one of the first decisions we took with Dame Amelia Fawcett, who is my great co-chair, was to include oceans and blue. Because as you said, Ralph, before, for the people who gave us this task, it was more about forests. And of course, large rainforests can play a very big role. And I don't want to oppose terrestrial with marine. So, but with the first thing we decided was to broaden our scope. And that's the reason why Robert Calcagno from the Institut Océanographique de Monte Carlo is on board. The second thing we decided, it was an initiative coming more from the ministries of environment. And here we need also to be aware that in the governments, topics are divided. So we decided to take the two treasuries on board. So we are build bridgers. And now we have 5 working groups working very hard on measurement. How can you measure the gains, the losses? How can you translate this from a science-based approach, which is very important, but with Carlos, I don't need to insist on it, to something that it is clear for people from finance. The second working group is on demand. What kind of demand is coming from companies? The panel we had this morning with great Italian companies was very eloquent. Many companies are making efforts. We need them. They may do it for ESG reasons, they may do it for compliance reasons, etc., but they will play, and I agree with you, Torsten, we need this private money. We have a supply working group, we need good projects. We have a stewardship working group because what we want in the long run is to not only to conceive the instruments with indigenous people and local communities, but also to make sure that everywhere on Earth, it is true for the South, but it is also true for our countries, that people are on board. We are not going to succeed if we don't convince the consumers, the people buying goods or being mobile to respect what we want. And the last thing is on governance. So I don't want to be too long on the process, but it was to explain to you what we try to do is to do a serious work. And as Mrs. Caselli said this morning, we are very, very humble because actually we don't know how to do it. But I say it without being discouraged. I think we need to admit that it is a work of such magnitude to change the whole economy, to change the whole society, that we may not have the right solutions immediately. And that's the reason why we decided also with Amelia Fawcett to do 2 things. The first one is to consult. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, so we do a first consultation around Christmas, a second one until the end of May. There will be a third one, and I invite you to go to our website, International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, IAPB, and you will see that during the summertime we will try to consult. So we need people from all spheres, all ecosystems, all regions in the world, bringing their experiences, what they know about their ecosystems, what they want, what they don't want. Because the second thing is that we really wanted to be, I don't want to put the blame on the people who worked on carbon, but actually what we hear is that there is not enough confidence in the carbon markets because they were not created with enough, in Italian you would say confidenza, with enough, it's more than trust, it's really that people share the main principles, that there is trust. And we prefer, even if it's an urgent matter, to do things seriously. So what we have in mind, our objective is in Cali, Colombia, October, next October, to come with a package which is not a blah blah declaration. It is not something we are going to negotiate with people who have no intention to implement. It is the other way around, is to draw all the lessons from the consultations and from existing efforts, and then make sure that we have pilot projects, even small scale, even sandboxing, but from several parts of the world, and that we put all these projects together, and that all these projects respect the principles we have set together through the consultations, not top-down, not from the north, not without the indigenous people, but all together, which is a translation issue, and even more than translation, because the whole system was not conceived to give nature her real value and space in our reasoning. And we hope that with these principles and guidelines, with this coalition of people willing to do something and the pilot projects, we will have put in place, we will have set the foundations. And I'm humble. If we manage to settle the foundations right, if then there is a momentum and a dynamic, then people after us, maybe, we don't know exactly what is going to happen. I refuse to think in terms of AIPB 2.0. I try to do what I'm supposed to do now, and then we will see. But what we hope is to have this broad support. And once again, the most important thing is to have something which is high integrity, where no one is going to do green or blue or whatever washing, and where the money is going where people deserve it, with a certain control. And I conclude on something, one of the reasons why we are also very humble is that, well, first of all, when you take France and the UK and you sincerely say that you want to work with the people in the South, some of them look at us saying, we know you. So we know what you did in the past. So I think this is a minor issue, but it is really to be a global problem, a global solution for a global problem. The second thing is that we need to be high integrity, because it is the only way to make sure that it develops in the right way. It is scale up, as you said. We are perfectly aware that we need billions and trillions, but before you have trillions, you need to begin with something solid. And here, what we really would like to do is to test, maybe to see that it's not going to succeed, and then test again and improve. And you will hear a fantastic example coming from New Zealand and the Maori and the Polynesia. What is specific to this area? What can be used elsewhere? So high integrity, global, inclusive, maybe small at the beginning, but you know what, we are actually very ambitious, but we don't say it too much, because it could be a game changer if we succeed, or it can be nothing if we don't, so I'm modest. I hope it will happen. And then really, please tell us if you know projects, if you are looking for good projects and you have the money, we will try to marry you, to put it this way.
Wonderful, thank you. So, Jean, you're a world expert in issues related to small island developing nations. You've worked extensively at the IMF and afterwards in the Caribbean. You worked on fragile states. So you're here all about, you know, blue natural capital. You hear about markets. How does that, is that first of all relevant to the SIDS? SIDS is small island developing nations, states. How is it relevant? And if it is, how is it relevant? And what can the SIDS do about it?
Thank you very much, Ralph. Let me start where I want to end. First, it is absolutely essential that you need a blue natural market, full stop. And it is absolutely necessary for the existence of SIDS that this has to happen. So let me say why.
Yep.
You've given us a good introduction, but I want to start from a almost philosophical perspective, because I think that defines the why and the how. I say, in the beginning, there was the world. In the end, the world that will be is how we evolve the world. Now, why do I say that? Because that's at the heart of the problem. The world as we know it is land, the waters, let's call that the oceans, the atmosphere, and all the species, people, animals, plants, fauna, flora, that live, as it were, on the land and the oceans, and for that matter, in the atmosphere. But we, as a people, have forgotten that. We forgot that. And so when you say 400 years ago, we started thinking about how we actually progress on the principle of infinite supply of resources. It is because we first and foremost said the most important part of the world are people, and that we are interested in the well-being of people. And the well-being of people has to rely on being able to undertake transactions. Transactions include creation, extinguishing, transfer, the exchange, or the transformation of things. That's how we get to well-being. And in the process of doing that, and based upon, Ralph, where you started, on what was infinite or not, we determined that we would measure wealth as wealth of people, as opposed to wealth of the world. Because if we had started with wealth of the world, then we would know the extinguishing, the depletion, the transformation, all of that matter. And so that was the first cardinal error that we made as a people. And consequently, we need to note that transactions only take place in our world in markets. Therefore, if we are to reverse the first principle of recognizing what we need is world wealth, planet wealth, then it is what transactions need to occur, the totality of transactions, to get us to a measure of world wealth, and therefore world well-being, and therefore the evolution of the world. Now that's the first big how. And so when we talk of markets, and Carlos, you said we are starting with natural assets, by definition, is the assets of the entire world, even if we want to start with one part, which is the oceans, and some people are already looking at the land, and of course we have natural assets in terms of people, but equally the bees, and the other elements that make up the world. How do we put value on those? And that's the other part, what markets provide, value. And so it is that value that generates the wealth. And so categorically for me, if I walk through that logic, then I need to be able to have assets, Torsten, that's your what, that make up wealth through the transactions that have to occur through markets. And those markets need to provide value so that we can, in principle, generate well-being and sustainability of the world. Now, that matters to seeds for the very reason that seeds are one part of the world that, in fact, have been, I would argue, left behind. Left behind without adequate voice and representation, left behind without adequate means for financing, left behind because we have not integrated the vulnerability and resilience issues that seeds face. So if seeds are to actually manage and get out of where they are now, first and foremost, we need to be able to elevate the discourse out of activity to net transactional wealth, natural assets, We'll start with the oceans, the land, carbon sequestration as a common denominator, but the ultimate goal has to be markets and value for the totality of natural assets, and that will allow seeds almost all of a sudden, if you think about it well, because that's where the concentration of natural assets are, to move from activity that has diminished their worth to their contribution to the entirety of planetary resources and the contribution to the evolution and sustainability of the planet, making them a significant contributor to the evolution of humanity and the world as we know it. So that is the fundamental principle. Now, how we actually do the small part, I think, is what we are talking about here. And for me, it is simply, you need a market. Market has to be able to value. And what do you need for valuing is what we should say is what's in need of now as the most important: standardization, being able to trade, having certification of what you are actually measuring, data, use of data, being able to promulgate the value of the system that we live in. These are things that are critical to be able to build that market to get us where we need to go to.
Thank you. So, Carlos, I know that you're involved in a number of projects in the Caribbean, and you're also involved with the wonderful Maori project in the Pacific. So you've heard our colleagues here. So can you elaborate on how you're engaged in these, what is it that you're seeing, for example, in the Caribbean? What are you seeing when you work with the Maori colleagues in New Zealand? And what's your reaction to all of that you've heard right now?
Very good. So let me just start by indicating that what we are talking about here is time sensitive. So time is not on our side, and history waits for no one. So while we consider how to do a good job, the clock is ticking. And the clock is ticking in that we cannot procrastinate, we need to move swiftly. And here I would invoke perhaps two mottos of Roman emperors. So again, one of them is Emperor Augustus in his seal. The motto is Fastina lente, which means hurry slowly. So we need to hurry, but we cannot afford committing errors. So that's where you were saying we need to do a good job, but the clock is ticking. So we need to balance that, the urgency of the now with the avoidance of critical mistakes that might lead to this opportunity to be wasted. We cannot afford being wasted, and the time is ticking strongest for coral reefs. So we have already lost about 2/3 of the coral reefs. We are now in the 4th global bleaching event. We don't yet have an assessment of how much we lost on the last year, but probably will be 1/3 to half of what was left. So this is not waiting for us. This is something we cannot leave a legacy to our children of an ocean devoid of coral reefs. We have talked about forest. Coral reefs are the tropical forests of the ocean, and yet they are animals living in symbiosis with algae. So they are looking at us, and they want us to move forward, hurrying slowly. So the second element that we can learn from a Roman emperor, that is Marcus Aurelius, that was a Stoic philosopher, is he wrote that the impediment for action propels action, and what stands in the way becomes the way. So we need to identify exactly what are the impediments for us to develop this promise of blue natural capital being an investable asset, because that will release the private contributions to be able to fix the problem, and it's mostly standardization metrics, but also the governance of this market. So that's really what is being put to test with the two projects that you mentioned. So in Bahamas, I was involved in discovery, and I had that intuition that Bahamas was the largest seagrass ecosystem in the world, and yet it was created only with 2,500 square kilometers of seagrass, but I thought there had to be a lot more. But it could not be resolved with satellites, so finally we instrumented tiger sharks with 360 cameras, and we released them, and they mapped the seagrass meadow for us. Turns out there are 92,000 square kilometers of seagrass in the Bahamas, and our assessment is about 1/3 was lost. So when I share with Ralph how much was lost and what's the total value, the estimate of the value that might come from rebuilding the lost seagrass is about $170 billion US dollars. So that's very significant for a small state like Bahamas. So they have implemented a project, and we were involved in designing the governance, the piece of legislation, the carbon trading market. But last year, I met with the Prime Minister of Bahamas in New York. I actually met with him 3 weeks ago again in Venice. And I gave him 3 pieces of advice. One of them is that I don't want the Bahamas to have the largest blue carbon project in the world. I want you to be the first natural capital project in the world. So it's not just about carbon, it's beyond carbon. The second is that the Bahamas must own the project. So now they are supported by myself, by Blue Green Futures and other people, but that project needs to be owned by Bahamians. So capacity building is fundamental, and you need to invest in capacity building. Within 5 years, I should not be involved, you should not be involved, it should be all owned by Bahamians. And the third piece of advice is that the funding cannot sit in the government. And that was a kind of a difficult conversation to tell to the Prime Minister, because then the funding comes in, and we've seen many projects be wasted because inconsistency. A change in government does away with a project that was supposed to last for 100 years. So you must create a trust that is not dominated and controlled by government. It's representation of government, and they have just created the Bahamas National Nature Trust on response to that. So that's what I'm learning and what I'm doing with Bahamas. I don't want to spoil the presentation of Mere, but I would say what I've learned mostly from the amazing project initiated by Maori, but now scale up around Polynesia, it's about values. And there are 3 principal values that we need to connect back with indigenous people, which is we are nature. So there is not nature and us. That doesn't work like that. We are nature, and we need to embed ourselves in nature. Then everything is interconnected. And then the way we operate is to take and give back. So those are the principles that inspire the project, and those are principles that we need to embed in our whole thinking of society. And it's not about scientists telling society what to do. There's been a lot. I learned that there's an element of scientific hubris that actually percolate through all of the conventions. Climate, listen to the scientists. The scientists are not going to fix it. I'm not going to fix it. And I learned that after putting 1,000 papers on the library, that putting one more paper in the library is not going to solve the problem. It's about co-creating solutions. So scientists are part of the conversation, but we need government, we need economists, we need private sector, and we need not storytellers, because there's too many storytellers, we need story doers. We need to create story by doing these things. So that is a joint enterprise that we all need to be part of.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlos. Torsten. You advise on many of these projects. You're involved in many of these projects. What else is missing from this conversation, in your opinion? If, for example, if we take the Bahamas or any of the SIDS who want to come to the market, where do they start? What would be your advice? Where do they start?
I think we learned from this example already, and I've had a similar discussion with the Seychelles. I think of these as large ocean states, that it is about impact. It's about the coastal seascape. So you have to think about that as a system, and you need to think about the intervention and the measure of the impact of the intervention. So that's why we talk about blue infrastructure. It's a large national effort that large national effort requires blue infrastructure. Blue infrastructure implementation requires private sector actors, and that means integrating nature-based solutions and innovation. So putting that together, you actually are creating the asset into which the private investor can put its money, because you're creating that entity that has longevity and that has the structure to be invested into. Now, the entry point, and this is exactly where we are at the moment, is that people just look at any of these big projects from what is the initial cost to get it off the ground, the capital expenditure, and they do not yet see the future potential cash flows that come out of the project. And this is where the whole narrative around our blue natural capital accounting becomes in, because we are essentially giving that investor the tool to say, you are putting something on your balance sheet that will provide multiple flows in future. And you can already put it on your balance sheet now. So this turns projects that are absolutely crucial in terms of ecosystem restoration, but are at the moment often seen as an obligation for a government that can't be funded, into projects that can be delivered with a strong private sector and innovative capacity, and linked with financial investors coming in thinking long term. And it's that switch that we're working on, and that's why I'm entirely with you. This is a complete shift we're creating, and that's why it takes those examples to actually show people in concrete cases. But we're really shifting an entire economy along these lines. And one of the starting points, one of the reasons why blue is such a great place to start with, is that we are working in a space that most people think is more challenging, has more public good characteristics, has fewer opportunities, and I'm turning it all around. That is exactly why the blue space is the best starting point for that, because we don't have to navigate millions of private property rights. We work with an environment that is already at scale. And so this is the right place to show this, and then obviously this become the paradigm throughout.
Fantastic. So, Sylvie.
Yeah, to sum up, we must be very quick to do something very difficult. No, I just wanted to say we don't procrastinate. I want to be clear, the fact that we try to work hard. The key question is, are we working hard or are we just postponing? It's just a point. No, maybe...
I meant we should not procrastinate, not you.
No, that's fine. No, you said it. It's... To be honest, we don't only have the impediment of not having the right theory in economy or the right management tools. We don't have the right political organization. To solve a global problem, no borders, for the whole mankind, the last thing we should have is a bunch of sovereign states pretending that they are completely sovereign and not interdependent. I'm sorry if I say something which is not politically correct, but the way we are facing rising nationalism is not going to help, because these questions require at least cooperation, and if we were serious with our children, we would even change the structure of the way the world is governed. Anyway, we do a second best thing, which is to deal with the states as they are, but we should not underestimate the fact that it is clear that, be it the Paris Agreement, be it the framework of Montreal Kunming, governments are doing everything to be not too much committed, not too, un poco ma non troppo, committed. And that is a real problem, because we never know if people are going to have the courage to take the right measures, and at the end it is about public good. It is trying to find private money to finance something that would be, in theory, much better financed by public money. Okay, my very last point, which is important, because you said we need a market. I just want to maybe do a footnote. You're right, this is what we need in the long run. we will not have one single market without a step or a phase in which we have different markets with S, trying to develop and scale up, because this is necessary, products. But the diversity of ecosystems, the diversity of jurisdiction, of regulations, etc., should advise us to go step by step, even if I agree with you on urgency. I mean, in any case, even if we are successful in what we are trying to produce, it's not going to be in October in Colombia, worldwide markets bringing money. It could be a range of markets, and then we will also move towards standardization, because as you said, it is needed. But I just wanted to make this small comment. Anyway, it is difficult, we don't have time, so that's the reason why such an event is so important.
My mom used to always say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Yes. So when people say, is the science there? So Carlos, let me, before I go to Jean, is the science there? Because you get this question, the ocean, is this, I get this from, the demand side of the equation. Is the science there?
No, the science can also always be improved, but the science that is needed to input into the governance and policy conversation is already there. So it's not really the bottleneck, it's not the science. The bottleneck is the mind shift, and I fully agree that it cannot be solved by looking at governments alone, because the fourth crisis is, so we have climate, biodiversity, food, which nobody talks about, but it's an impending food crisis. The fourth one is the inability to work together. So we live in a polarized world across geographies, within countries, and that makes it very hard to solve global problems. So, but certainly, I don't think science is the problem, and we shouldn't keep the ball in our court. We should hand over to you what we know to take action.
Thank you. So science is not the issue. Now, Jean, you were talking about a world wealth. Now, when you say world, to us economists, the idea of the social planner comes in, because who's going to manage the world on behalf of the world? So then the question of governance comes in, right? I mean, you posited so now I'm going to follow you on this. So because what we observe right now is what Sylvie is saying, I guess we're all saying, this role of building those markets have been abdicated to the markets. And so the invisible hand has been given the full hand to develop this market, and the visible hand is not present. So the visible hand, i.e. of somebody at the top being in charge, is invisible, and the markets are now having to come up with their own solutions for a problem that you said, we're all saying, is a global commons. And we all know from economics, first welfare theorem, when you have a public good, the decentralized solution will not give you the optimal solution.
I agree, Ralph, and maybe let me make 3 points. The first is I've reinterpreted the Roman saying to let us adopt the principle of deliberate haste. I like the deliberate haste because it gives you the sense of thinking through, not being too blasé, but haste, because we have no choice but to do things quickly. The second is governance is always a choice. And I think we miss that. Governance is always a choice, and it will not be the same across time in every situation. So you have to always tailor the governance for the scenario you are entertaining in the future. So decentralization may have worked in a certain context, but now what we want is a new governance construct that will do the outcomes that we are looking to achieve through what means. And for us, for now, I think the third point I want to make is money always needs a home. Why? Because money doesn't exist for money's sake. It's to be able to do something. And so the concept of a home is to facilitate that. And so what we are proposing for seeds in aggregate as of last week is we need a seeds-focused, outcomes-driven, global in nature institution with the appropriate governance structure that will actually get rid of the inequities that seeds face and not generate their development, because I think that's the wrong word, but generate their sustained evolution, which is a just, fair development concept. And that is what we are now proposing as a development bank for resilient prosperity for all seeds put together.
Wonderful. So basically the seeds are maybe too small by themselves.
Seeds are too small on their own, so they lack voice and representation. We need to ensure that there is scalability, which is one of the questions that you are raising, efficiency through both replication and aggregation, that will, through the process of dissemination of knowledge based upon data, and when I say data, information and knowledge creation, will actually help do the three things that we have talked about: appropriate fit-for-purpose investments, access and mobilization of finance, the money to be able to do it, and capacity building to ensure that what you have is empowerment to continue the future and not dependency of a particular point in time. So that is the how. I think we are going to do this. The details, of course, fit in, but these elements need to be there to make a success of this.
Okay. I know we have to conclude. I'm just regaining our 10 minutes that was taken away from us, but I'm reclaiming it. We've been talking about sort of mostly the supply side of the equation. If we have somebody from the corporate side here, and they're saying, okay, the SIDS are open for business, they have natural capital to sell. I'm just using Carlos's idea. So it's not only carbon, it's not only biodiversity, but it's a social credit and a cultural credit. Okay, what's in it for me? Who would like to take? What's in it for the corporates, the demand side of the equation? Why should I invest in? And we want to avoid here philanthropy and goodwill and altruism and all this stuff. Purely value proposition. Why should I do it?
So this is a Blue Economy Summit, right?
Yep.
The Blue Economy Summit is a new value proposition that makes the ocean investable, but not away from the traditional extractive approach to ocean. And it has 4 pillars. That is ocean energy, then blue superfoods, which is not like a fishery at a high level, but foods that are healthy for us, healthy for the planet, and affordable for all. The third one is marine genetic resources and natural products. And the fourth one, which is the infrastructure that supports everything else, is natural capital. The first 3 already have markets and already have financial instruments, private sector involvement. The fourth one, which is the underpinning of the other 3, is the one that is pending. And the blue economy has the potential to multiply by 5 the global revenue from ocean and do that in a regenerative manner. So it's really probably the best value proposition for investment since the Industrial Revolution. There's great gains to be made, and the ocean is open for business.
Wonderful. Torsten?
I completely agree. And if you just think about you're investing in a space that is improving through your investment. So you're not just reaping the direct benefit, but you're actually growing the space in which that investment is taking place. So you're by definition on the rising ship.
Wonderful. And Sylvie?
For many sectors, it is about their own value chain. Make sure that they continue to have fish to fish. They continue to have la bellezza for tourism, etc. So I think it is a matter of self-interest. And I really believe that this can be powerful. Once again, as you said, on the invisible hand, I'm quite sure that governments have a role to play in putting in place the right frameworks to make incentives. Because you know what? We already know what light touch, market-driven supervision is. It brought us to the financial crisis in 2009.
Quickly, one is, I think from a SIDS perspective, Starting with the blue not only makes a lot of sense, it is transformative because we like to think of ourselves today, not as small island developing states, but as large ocean states. Let us reclaim that right to more than to hold on to less. That's the first point. Beautiful. All the areas you talk of make a lot of sense. The second is the market that we talk of, the blue natural market. I think it has to be based on the principle of partnerships. And when I say partnerships, complementary relations that focus on delivery of the whole and not on the interests of parts of the whole. And I think that's the fundamental problem we've had. Government, public are seen as one, private as another. And there is a mutual distrust that exists as opposed to we need public, private, civil society, special interest groups, ecological, scientific communities to see how best can we work complementarily to generate this natural wealth that we are talking about for the, not people, the evolution of the planet in a sustainable way.
Wonderful.
We all benefit.
Thank you. All right, so if I may just summarize, if anybody says, okay, so what do we get? What you heard from the panel is, first, the science is there. Yep. Next is the provenance. You need the provenance, the ownership. You have to, and then that allows you, as Torsten said, to put it on the balance sheet. Once you put it on the balance sheet, that changes your net worth. For countries that are indebted, changes your debt dynamics, changes your whole outlook. And as Sylvie is saying, it's not about carbon. It's much more than carbon. Biodiversity broadly defined. And we all know markets. Markets are about efficiency, not about equity. We have to bake equity into this market, which is what Jean is saying. And of course, and to equity, the moment you say you want to bake it in, who's going to bake it in? You need the visible hand, which seems to be invisible here in this audience. I'd like to thank my colleagues. Would like to thank you for your patience. Thank you very much.